chair now recognizes himself. First, the chair would like to thank all of the witnesses for coming and appearing, and particularly in preparing your testimony on short notice. Let me say that the purpose for which this hearing was called and the scope of the hearing was stated in the letter that was submitted to me, signed by the Democratic members, which was the reauthorization of the USA Patriot Act. I've sat here listening very patiently to the testimony, to the questions, to the answers, and much of what has been stated is not relevant to the 16 sections of the USA Patriot Act, which were sunsetted when the law was enacted in October of 2001. One of the things that people who are opposed to the Patriot Act have been doing is stating that the Patriot Act was responsible for a whole host of frustrations or objections to administration policy. This hearing confirmed that fact, that the Patriot Act is being used as a buzzword for people who have very broad brush objections. I think that when Congress debates the reauthorization of the Patriot Act, we ought to stick to the subject, and that subject is the 16 provisions of the Patriot Act, which we must consider and decide whether to reauthorize, whether to lapse, or whether to amend. The Patriot Act has nothing to do with Guantanamo Bay. The Patriot Act has nothing to do with enemy combatants. The Patriot Act has nothing to do with indefinite detentions. Those were provisions of other sections of the law, many of which occurred prior to the enactment of the Patriot Act in October of 2001. The so-called CREPI memorandum, which had a blanket closure of immigration proceedings, was issued before the Patriot Act was enacted, and the Deputy Attorney General testified earlier this week that it's no longer being followed. And some of the testimony related to provisions of the Patriot Act that were not sunsetted. And this committee put the sunset on provisions of the law which actually increased the powers of law enforcement, but did not put the sunset on those provisions of the law which restated the powers that law enforcement had had prior to October of 2001. I think particularly irresponsible and indicative of the broad brush accusations of the Patriot Act was what I just heard, saying the Patriot Act has resulted in Minutemen being on the border. That's not true, and that's irresponsible, and I think anybody who knows what is going on will see. No, I will not yield. We'll see that fact. You know, let me say that I think this hearing very, very clearly shows what the opponents of the Patriot Act are doing. They'll talk about practically everything but what's in the Patriot Act and what this committee is considering. The only really relevant testimony that I heard was from Mr. Pitts relative to Section 215 of the Patriot Act that said that librarians have been receiving all kinds of questions from law enforcement. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Pitts, to submit for the record the names of the librarians that have received actual Section 215 orders from the FISA court to produce business records, and we'll give you a week to put that in the record. So thank you all for coming today. I thank the members for changing their schedules to participate, and the committee is adjourned.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. He won't. I said point of order.
Do we have any press in the room that want to hear our side of the story?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to read into the record, since the Chairman tried to adjourn without hearing my point of order. We are entitled under Section Rule 11, Clause 2, J2A, to additional time for testimony or for comment. I just want to comment that the Chairman is correct when he says that there's been a lot of confusion about what is in the Patriot Act and what is not in the Patriot Act. And that some of what we are talking about in the Patriot Act, some of what we're talking about is the administration getting around Section 412 of the Patriot Act for indefinite detention, and that's relevant to a Patriot Act hearing. And part of the problem is that we have not had the opportunity to have hearings on all these other administration policies that have led to abuses such as indefinite detention. But the other thing that I wanted to say, and that I will say at this point, even though the chairman is not going to listen, is, and I wish, is that it is very obvious. I think I can speak to most people in this idea. It's very obvious. The United States, for most of its history, has been a beacon of light and truth, justice, freedom, and liberty. Those of us who question some aspects of the Patriot Act, and those of us who question some of I noticed that my mic can turn over, that can be heard anyway. And those of us who question some of the actions of the administration are seeking to make sure that our tradition of liberty and freedom is continued unsullied, and that when we question acts of an administration or in particular agents of the executive branch, we are not besmirching the honor or traditions of the United States. We are seeking to uphold it. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I asked to yield.
I did something totally inappropriate. No mic on and no record being kept. But I think as we are lecturing foreign governments about the conduct of their behavior with regard to opposition, when I see the behavior I saw here today as an American, I'm really troubled about what kind of lesson this is going to teach to other countries in the world about how they ought to conduct an open society that allows for an opposition with rights. And I'm sorry, I'm very